Bueno, ahora sí, vamos a dar por inicio en forma oficial.
Okay, so now let's formally start this webinar. Thank you very much for being here. Thanks for being part of the audience of our webinar cycle. Today, we're going to be talking about front-end development, first steps. So we're going to start with a design of just a few screens of an application, and you will see how the implementation takes place in GeneXus, always respecting the design principles. Today, we will have with us Cecilia Pasalacqua, Cecilia Fernandez, and Nicolas Camera. Without further ado, then, you speakers, you have the floor. Remember that we have simultaneous interpreting into English and Portuguese. For that, click on the interpretation icon and choose the language of your preference. After the presentation, we're going to have a Q&A session where you could ask the speakers about any questions you may have. So thank you very much. You speakers, you have the floor. Thank you, Aníbal, for the introduction. Thank you, all of you, for being here. We are very happy to be here. And in a way, this confirms that idea that we had of the GeneXus community needing more of these instances. I'm talking about front-end applications. Okay, so first of all, I would like to tell you that in this webinar, we have two Cecilias. So I'm Chechu, and Ceci will be Cecilia Fernandez, okay? So that you know who is who. Also, to let you know that we are starting developing a course on front end, even though we understand that there are several courses that work on front end in GeneXus, we wanted to have and design a strategic course exclusively for GeneXus on front end. So in this webinar, we're going to be telling you and sharing with you what we have done so far, because we believe there's a need for the whole community. We didn't know how to segment this presentation because we didn't know the average level of the audience. So we're going to start from scratch. So if you do have some knowledge of GeneXus front end, you may find some of the components a little bit basic at first. So basically, we assume that nobody knew about this. This will be our agenda for today. First, we're going to be providing some context about the options and the different ways in which we can include design in GeneXus. Then we're going to be talking about best practices, especially in the relationship between designer and front-end developer. After that, we're going to have a case study. We're going to compare a small case study that is very, very small, but it's going to be very useful to analyze different cross-cutting aspects. And then we're going to do a recap, and then we're going to have a Q&A session. So in this first part, we wanted to give you some context about the tools available today in GeneXus to implement design. So just to make it simpler, as a designer, when I think about the role of front-end, I think that front-end is the person that will make my design come to life. So if I'm working on a digital product, for instance, I'm designing a button, the one that will be in charge of working on that button from the aesthetic point of view and functional point of view, that will be the front-end developer. In GeneXus, we have several tools that we can use to work on design. When we talk about front-end, we're talking about implementing from scratch. But in this webinar, we wanted to also share some other options that we had that will depend on the project, the needs, the requirements of the projects, deadlines. All those things will help us to think about the best strategy on how to go about front end. So as a summary, I just wanted to share three options. There are more, of course, but these are the three I wouldn't like to say most important, but let's say the most popular in GeneXus to implement design. One is Unanimo. Probably, if you know a little bit about GeneXus, you probably have heard about this. Is a multi-experience design system that is for large projects that can be updated. Today is the default design system for GeneXus. Then we have Import. Import is a tool that allows designers to create a file that can be directly imported to GeneXus. So GeneXus can interpret what is shown by the design in a very reliable way, let's say. And then we have Frontend, what I told you at the beginning. Frontend for us is basically to implement from scratch a design. I'm working with a designer and I need to implement that in GeneXus. For that, we have a set of tools and processes that we can use in order to carry out that implementation. Since this topic is pretty vast, I wanted to share these presentations, deep dives from last year, where some of these strategies are dealt with. And you have some extra strategies that you can look at. If you scan that QR code, it will directly take you to the website and you will be able to see those presentations. I thought this was pretty useful for you. Okay, so based on what I told you about Frontend being the tool that makes designer basically make my idea come to life, basically we need to provide a file that can be understood by the front end. It should be very clear so that they don't have to make any decisions. So we have a set of best practices in order to make that file more technical so that we can help the front end person to understand what I've done. Something that is important for me is organization of the file, for instance. That includes the names of the layers, how contents are grouped together. If there are elements that are repeated, try to componentizing recurring elements. That is about the structure of the file. Something else that is important as a designer, I can have an overview of all my sprints and think ways of making implementation easier in front end. So we have an example that we're going to be showing you. If I have 4 or 5 screens that are very similar in structure and just some small details are changed, maybe I can omit those changes and leave those pages untouched so that then front end can use it as a master page or a master panel in order to make his or her life easier. I think it's very important for designers to understand at least basic concept of front end so that I can see how make implementation easier. In some cases, changes are very, very small and they solve a lot of problems. Something else that is fundamental that goes hand in hand with file organization is basically to create color and text styles. For instance, like a month ago, there was a new feature by Figma. Figma, for those of you who don't know about it, I think this is the main tool in order to generate digital products from the design standpoint. And they launched some new features that allows designers to define more things. For instance, variables. There's a trend now in the industry that for designs to be more and more technical. So design tools are now including new features so that we can deliver final files with more detail in order to make the front-end life easier so that they don't have to make any decisions about the file. Those new features are not being used today because they are in the beta mode, but there are some that basically allows you to create color and text styles. Just with that, I'm providing a lot of information to front end and I'm saving him or her a lot of time. Something else that is important is that factor about componentizing recurring elements in the file. Imagine I have a footer that is repeated in 5 different screens. I can define that as a component and basically include those in each of the screens. That will allow Frontend to realize what they can generate through a stencil. Before moving on to the next slide, I will switch screens so I can show you this file. I thought it was interesting to share it with you. The file we're going to be working on today is this one here. So this is what I was telling you about in the previous slide. How to organize this? Well, I can select screens, or I can have all the frames and the different names. I have all the elements here clearly defined. If I have components here, if I have a footer, a call to action, or a button that is repeated in different pages, I can go and define it as a component. Something else that is important, if the buttons really have status or not, if they're going to behave in different ways depending on what happens, I need to define that too. So if I do that, then Frontend will not have to think about this. What happens with the buttons when they're active or in default? Something else that is important, if I go here to the frame, I can go to this section here on the right that will be showing all the different colors used in that frame. And as you see, all these colors are already defined. These are part of a style. I have also defined the text styles. If I click here, I know it's a general here, general, or I can go to the different titles, H1, H2, tablet H1, or phone. I have cards. If I componentize and arrange in styles all these, I'm saving a lot of time for the developer. Something else I wanted to show you, it's a plugin, because if you click here on the frame, it allows me to see the color, but it's not showing the text. For that, I need to click and see the style and then get into style to see the typography. But there is a plugin of Figma that is called Style Organizer. And I can ask this plugin to scan a page and will scan it in 2 Fs, the colors, and it will tell me whether these colors are defined following a style or not. This one here is unlinked. So I may think that before sending this to Frontend, I can define these links here. And then I have another one for text. And it tells me which are the texts that were on the page that is scanned. It tells me all the properties. And again, if they have a style linked to them or if they do not have a style linked. This is very easy to use, and it allows us, designer, to check the file before sharing that file with the frontend. Ceci, would you like to share your screen? Lastly, and to wrap it up, this part of the context, it's very important to have, that link or that relationship that we have with the front end or the back end. We know that digital products go through different roles and people, and it is important for us to get involved in the process from research to final implementation. The product is unique. We are all involved in the process. And in order to do that, good communication is key. So what we need to do is try to understand the role of our colleagues, also to work with and follow certain conventions, to try to use a shared language. And if a decision needs to be made, if it is not clear what to do, we need to discuss that together. We need to have that opportunity to exchange ideas and try to bridge that gap between designers and developers. So Cecilia will continue. She will be the front end. I'm the designer, and I have just sent my file that is systematized, probably with some mistakes that she will get mad at me. But now it's her turn, and she will tell us about implementation once she receives the file. Okay, hello, thank you. Can you hear me all right? So now I will start working. There's a lot to tell you about. Here, as you can see, there are 3 of the 4 screens that Chechu designed for me. This could be the first thing that we do at the front end, basically to analyze the different screens and try to see the browsing between them and regularities that may come up. For instance, the first thing that we will define in this case, and something I forgot to mention, the application that we're going to be developing right now is going to be, we're going to start from scratch with an empty KB, and we're going to be developing this Angular web. Why Angular? Because it's the most modern and it's the trend, let's say. And also this allows us to focus on multi-platform. If we develop an Angular application, we're going to be working with the same kind of object that then will be used for the native application. So now let's focus on Angular, screen size, web Angular, desktop. Okay, we're going to be focusing on that. So this will be just to get our version 1 of the application. Then we will continue working, implementing all the other sizes, and then moving on to the native application, if that is required. So taking those things into account, we can start with these 3 screens. Now we can see a lot of regularities. So we can see that these components here, when it comes to design, these just don't change. We have a header and a footer, and they are shared by all the pages. So these parts will be implemented in a master panel. Then we have specific information for each page, and these are going to be our panels. So how to start? We're going to be starting by implementing the home panel. The idea here is to show you, since I don't know how much you know about this topic, basically we're going to focus on one small portion, just to tell you about the different actors involved in the development of this application when it comes to front end. So let's start with the home panel. So I will show you a small clip in order to save time. So basically we want to start here with an empty KB. I will create a module that is Angular within that folder, user interface, and we're going to create our first object that is panel on. So what is it that we're going to do? In home, we can see here that the information can be grouped in a table of 2 rows. One when you have the text at the bottom, and the second one, I'm going to be working with that later, or you can do it on your own. So first thing is that we're going to check it's 712 pixels. This is Figma, remember? Now we go back to GeneXus. We have the main table here, and all panels are created with a main table by default. So first thing, I'm gonna insert one more row to that table. Okay, so now I have 2 rows. And here it is very important to pay attention to this property, row style, that tells me the height of each row. As you can see, it has 2 values by default. There are this PD, that is platform default. Each platform has a specific default. In the case of Angular, is 64 pixels. It will depend on the platform. we have that value, but also we have two more units, that is percentage and dips, that is device independent pixel. So we're going to write here 712 dips for the first row. Dips, one dip is 1 pixel, okay? So it's the same to write dips or pixels. But these properties only accept dips. I'm telling you this because this may change in some other application. And then for the second row, we are going to ask it to cover the other 100%. So of the total height, 712 will dips for the first row, and the remaining will be for the second row. Okay, so now let's focus on the implementation of this block of information. And let's see how to reflect this on the panel. If we see here, we have like two big blocks of information. This one here on the left, and this one, and this text on the right. Apart from that, in Figma, we can see that there are some spaces between these components. For instance, we can see that there's going to be a space of 100 dips or pixels on the left, on the right, and right in the middle, we have one of 80 dips. So we need to take into account that we're going to be using a table for the second row with 5 columns. These columns provide space and other columns in which we're going to be including the controls with the information that we want. So there we have a table with 5 columns that is inserted, embedded in the first row of the main table. So what is it that we do? We can see there's a property that is column style, similar to the other one that it was row style. And by default, it can tell us that each column will be 20% of the full width of that table. And the table is in the main row, the first row of the main table. So first thing we're going to do is to give 100 dips for the first column, that is the space that we wanted on the left, 100 dips for the one on the right. The third one is the space in between, that is 80 dips. And then we had the second column and the fourth column that basically contain the information. We didn't see it in Figma, but let's say that they will take the remaining 50%, remaining of the total width. So there we can see the definitions. And then if we go to rows style, this part of our table, a table that has only one row. So how is it that we want that row to be? It's not going to be platform default. We want that row to take 100% of the first row of the main table. See, it wrote 100% in height. And if we go one level up and we edit the table in which the subordinated table is embedded in, we saw that the height was 712 dips. So that is how we start working. We're going to insert one table in the second column and a text block in the fourth one. And they will represent these two information elements that we have here. A table, because it will have some other controls in it. And that table will be at the same distance on the vertical axis. And this one here will also be aligned. So we go back to GeneXus. And we see that this table, since it is embedded in another table, in fact, it's within that table, one cell. And we have this group here, cell information. When we click on table properties And among those properties, we have vertical alignment. And we're going to select middle. And for the text block, we're going to be doing the same thing. So now we are going to be changing this name, and we can include a caption. What we're doing here is to change from autogrow to true. That is the one being used in the web platforms. This means that if the contents of the text block is larger than the height of the container, it will allow it to expand. Then in the event client start, when the panel is executed, we're going to be including this caption. We go back to Figma, and we see here that we can copy this file, and we're going to be copying each paragraph independently. Why? Because we want to include these characters of new line so that we can define the space between paragraphs. So now let's change the table name and let's design the table. How to do that? Following the same instructions as the previous one. We're going to be creating this table, and we're going to specify that we want it to have 3 rows and 3 columns. The columns on the sides are just to give some space, and in the Figma file is 72 pixels. We're going to have 3 rows, and the one in the middle will also provide space of 20 between the text block and the button. Also, we can see that both the button and the text block will be aligned horizontally, and they will also be aligned vertically. So we insert the text block, we change the name, we include the caption, the autogrow property, we check true, and it's the same thing that we did in the previous one. Basically, to define the alignment, horizontal center, vertical middle, then we add 2 more columns, to the right, to the left, and 2 rows. Then we do the same thing. We include the 72 dips of the columns on the sides and 100% for the one in the middle, because we wanted to take the 100% of the remaining area. And for the rows, we know that that row in the middle takes 20 dips. What we don't know, because we didn't check it, is what is the height of each of these 2 cells. So we go to Figma to try to get that information. We position on the element, and we can see that it says 237 pixels, that is height. And here you can see on the right, what is the height of the line? As you can see, there are 2 lines. Okay, well, the height of that line is 78.23 pixels. We're going to see that in a couple of minutes, and there will be a CSS property that will define the height of this element. And then the same thing for the button. We can see there that it takes 48 pixels, that is the height. And then we go back to the table, we go to properties, row style, and we include those values. So the row style properties of these 3 rows are the same, and they are in dips. It adds up, and it ends up being 305 dips. So now what we're going to do, we're going to insert that button. We insert the button. We're going to tell it that we want to align it horizontally, center. And what we're going to be doing now is to indicate that in the chart, we're going to be including the controls. And we have already defined where these controls will be in the layout. So basically, now we're going to execute this. So we use this panel as main, and let's execute it. And let's see what we can see in execution. Okay, we can see the controls where they are supposed to be, but design, not too much, right? We want to see this, and we have this instead. So let's try to give this some design to each of these components. Let's start with the text, the new age of exploration. So we go back to Figma. So if in Figma we select the element, we see that there's a series of properties, CSS properties. For instance, we see that there is a font family being used, font weight, line height, also the kind of color that they are using. That color that we see is defined, as Chechu told us at the beginning, has been defined within Figma, and that is called secondary. So what we are seeing here is of the CSS properties. So now we go back to GeneXus and try to see what to define those properties, those features. Well, if we edit the text block control, we see that there's a class property. As we can see, class is text block by default. Those definitions of classes that will contain the features of each element of each control in the layout will be defined in an object, and the object is design system. Every KB is created by default with a design system that is predefined, and we edit the properties of the version. We can see that this is called default style. The style corresponds to the object design system that contains all those definitions. By default, this design system object is created at the KB with the same name. Then this design system objects, if I go back here, it says web interface, and web interface controls the development of the application with web panels, but that is not our case. We are developing this for Angular, so we are using panels and not web panels. So how can we do about it? So now if we look at the observations of the platform, we can see here in this node any web screen, and this corresponds to Angular for any screen size. We can see that the one predefined is Unanimo Angular. Unanimo is already a design system that is predefined. You can find this in all KB is created with the GeneXus Unanimo feature. And there you will find that design system object that will control everything. If I don't do anything, we are not going to be using that one because we want to start from scratch. We want to implement from scratch without using any of this. So what we are doing is to create an object, a design system object, that will be the one used for our Angular application. So basically, I will create a module, and there I will create a design system object, that is the object, and I call that travel agency Angular. I will create that, and it's going to be empty. So first I will define, we can see that there are two tabs, one for tokens and one for styles. So we will initialize everything, and we're going to give it a name for the set of tokens that we're going to be creating, and the same for the styles. So now we're going to be working on this object. And in this object, we're going to provide style for all the controls. So now I want to tell Angular, ask Angular to use this design system object. For that, we come here to the platform and we change Unanimo Angular for this object that we have just created, that is empty so far. If you see here, we can define that for each screen size. And we can see here how it is inheriting that style. But we could customize this and change the system object depending on the screen size. So now let's start working. What is it that we want to do? Let's define a color constant that we have identified in Figma. What was it? The one that Chechu called secondary. It's like giving it a name, giving the color a name. So basically, we're gonna come to this section here, and we're gonna copy the value for that color, and we're gonna copy it here. On the right, we can see that there's another editor. These are synchronized. We can work on one or the other. Everything that we do on one of them is going to be reflected on the other. So far, we have defined a constant, a color constant. These are called tokens. With this is just a definition, but what we want to do is to give this control here some style. If we check here, Chechu worked well and created a style for our text, and it called titles H2. So what we are going to do is to copy all these properties, CSS, and then here we are going to be creating selecting the class that will provide style to that control. We're going to call it with a very similar name, H2 title. These are like the CSS classes. In fact, we're going to copy that, all the things in Figma, and all these properties are the CSS properties. So first thing we do is to change what's here for, we're saying, which is the color to be used for the H2 title class. Which color? Secondary in the tokens. And then with this symbol, we can select a token that is going to be color. And which one? Well, secondary. So for all control with this class, it will be applying that color. Second property, text align center. We're going to remove that because the alignment of the text, we already did that during layout. This is a comment, we get rid of that. And then we are specifying the font family here. All these are characteristics of fonts. Okay, font family, then that font family, Hebo, is not a predefined family. So our next step then is to define the DCO, which is the font. We need to include that font in the DCO. To do that, we're going to be using the font family property. There we can select which family we're going to be using. And since it's not predefined, what we're going to do is to import that file into the KB. So we're going to go to Files, New File. You're going to create a file with that name. We're going to look for it in the folders. And we select this one. Once we import that file, we can use it. So basically, we're giving a name to the font family. But here, we indicated where to get that file from. So with the GX library function, it provides different options. So we select GX file, and now we have the file that we had just created. Basically, we are telling the DCO to include that specific font. Then we go to class, and we ask it to use that font. So I write exactly the same name. Then also this font, Hebo, is font weight 700. This as a comment, we're going to be using several sizes for the same font family, and these properties are not necessary, so I can get rid of them. So next stage is font size to indicate the size of the font. That is 67 pixels. And now we have only these four properties: color, font family, font size, and line height. So what to do now? Basically, we provide style, or we specified the features for that class, H2 title. What we're going to have to do now is to tell our text block control to adopt that class. Once we've done that, we execute it, and now we can see the style for that specific class. Now, same thing for the other elements. So for the text on the right, I'm going to be doing exactly the same thing. So I go to Figma. I can see here that the designer has already selected a style and then have provided it with a name. And these are the characteristics being used. So this is the name, regular paragraphs. I will copy all the properties. And then I will take all this to my DCO in GeneXus. I will create a class that is the class that I will use for this other text block. And this class will be called regular paragraph, and I will be doing exactly the same thing. They are using some other colors here. It's this kind of gray. And Chechu also named this that is called gray 600. We're going to copy that value. We are going to go to the token tab to define a new color token. We're going to call it gray 600. And then exactly the same thing. We're going to go to the style tab. You're going to go to select that color token. And again, the same process. We see that we're using the same family font, but with a different weight. So now we're going to be importing another file for that specific font. So this is kind of iterative. So we are going to write the font face rule. You're going to go to files, create a new file in order to import that Hebrew regular. I will rush now. So we're just repeating the same thing. I select where it is, and that is the one I'm using here in this class. Font style and font weight are not necessary, so I got rid of them. And something that I'm adding here some things just in case. This property allows me that those spaces that we added, those such as new line, I want them to consider it break spaces. Now I will show it to you so that I can have the spacing within or between paragraphs. Next step, I go to home, I change class, I include this new class now, and let's try it. See, now it looks more similar to our original intention. Now we have to do the same thing with the button. So now let's focus on the button. In the button here, we can see that the button is composed of two things. One is that thing in the background. And if you see it here, it has these two colors. So we have these two colors, primary and secondary. The secondary, we have that already. And the primary, we need to create it through a token. So let's go to color token primary. On the right in the editor, you can see the colors. So now what we are doing basically is to give this button some style. So we're going to be creating a class for this specific button. If we look at this here, we have a border radius here that is for this 30% of the round border. And also we have the background color. Also, there's a text. And that text it has a color, there's a secondary color. And we can see here that Chechu called this buttons primary with all the fonts. And here there's another property that is text transform. And basically it allows it to, whatever I write is going to be always in capital letters. So I will copy all these properties that are the properties that correspond to the text. I will copy that. So I go through the same process. I select the token, secondary, dark green. I include the font family. This is exactly the same. I create this. And I leave the text transform property as it is. So then this is the style of the text. Now there's something missing. What is it? Oh, the thing here, the background with the round line. And also something else is that that text is, in fact, it has padding here. There is a 15 padding. That is what separates the text from the outer borders, let's say. So basically, we're going to be copying these properties, the background column, then. So I'm adding here the padding. As you can see, there's a scroll down menu, and we can select the one we want. We're going to be choosing this padding inline. I'm going to rush through this. We're using the logic properties, not the physical properties. This padding inline is similar to padding, but this will allow us that if we're on right to left writing mode, the padding inline is logic, let's say, depending on where you start. So I think that here, this is going to be using 15 pixels on each side. And something else that I'm doing here, I'm in the width property with this value, max content. Max content, basically, it's telling it to occupy the maximum width so that all the contents can be read without any kind of overlapping. When we are, imagine we're using an application that translates, for instance, for localization, for different languages. So if we don't know how much it's going to take, depending on the language, with this function, I'm going to make sure that it will be enough, the width of the cell for that content. So now we are doing this, and let's execute it just to check run. Okay, there we can see we know it has a maximum width. We have the context, and with that 15 of padding, that's enough. But the original is not like that. So we can see here. So here we have the width and the height are fixed, 169 and 48. So we can go to this section and then define this at design level. This will be more relevant than the property on the other side. So now you can see it's exactly the same. Then something else, something that Chechu showed you at the beginning, we could change the style of the button depending on the status. So you have this green that is lighter than the other one. So basically we want to do that. So we wanted the button to be highlighted, and when it is highlighted, we want to change the background color. So we're going to create a class button primary highlighted. So basically we want to define background color for this class, and we're going to create a new token for that. Primary hover, we are assigning that value from Figma, and here we're going to specify that token. So what's missing now? We have just class there. How does the button know that if we click on the button, it needs to now change to that class? Okay, well, here is when we use some other properties that are not CSS, but these are GeneXus's specific properties. And these are JX properties. So here we have the GeneXus button highlighted class. So when the button is highlighted, it will take these definitions from this other class. So it will be added to these definitions and it will add this other class. So it will be overwriting the background color and nothing else. So now we're going to run it. So now we can see how it changes when we click on the button. And that is little by little how we build this DCO. This is the minimum that we needed to know to get to know about the different participants in this front-end world. So now we know the different actors involved. Now let's have a look. So the first thing would be to check on the different controls of the different screens. To see this kind of aspects defined by the designers, we have H2 title class. Because we are having an H1 title that is for this other control. And if we check here, down here, we're going to see that in the banner, Chechu specified that the style for this text would correspond to a style that is called H1 banner. And we don't need to be very intelligent to realize that probably this one is H2 banner. And then if we check this text for the copyright, Chechu called it copyright general. And if we check the full screen, we can see all the colors here. So we can have all this information beforehand, and you can start writing tokens for different colors at the DCO before doing all the things that we did. If we go here to tractions, we can see all the colors that were defined for this website. Here we have another H1. So the designer, in a way, structured all the information in a way that makes it very, very easy to translate that into our DCO. For the DCO, we have different regions, and that helps us to put everything in order, to organize everything in the DCO. It has no impact on behavior. So now we are creating a title region with the different classes, H1 titles and H2 titles. And we're going to be doing that for each of them. It's just to organize all the information. And in fact, here we have the button information. And now everything is organized. We can expand and collapse all this. And we can see that the DCO, as it starts growing, is going to get more and more complex. The same thing can be done with the tokens. We can define regions for the tokens. And by doing that, we're going to have two regions. So it's going to be one for the application and one neutral. And that would be the way to work, the way to go about it. So again, here we can see the colors. And what I did was to translate those colors. And then I directly include those in the token section of the DCO. Here, what we can see on the right, that's another way of looking at the colors. And we can collapse all these different regions. So now let's move on. We can use color tokens, but also we can define tokens for some other things. For instance, for spacing, for font sizes, H1, 75 pixels, H2, something different. And then we have the light mode for this application, but also Chechu designed the dark version. If we compare these two versions, let's focus on this part that we implemented today, that is the central components of the text. I'm gonna see them, and we can see that it's a little bit more complex because the background color changes, the class color changes, H1 title changes, paragraph and buttons. everything changes. How can I make or implement all these variations at a minimum cost? When we go to this part, we realize that we have made a mistake when working with the tokens. When we have the abstraction of the tokens, this color constant that we are now using it, can be made more and more complex, and we can create very interesting definitions. Here we can see that all these texts are on a background that we're going to call surface, and we're going to create a token that is going to be called surface. In the case of the light version, it's going to be gray 00, that is white, and for the dark version, it's going to be gray dark. If we look at the text block right here on top, we can identify that color and the color to be used on top of that surface. For instance, for this token, we're going to have on surface 1, that is going to be the dark green, that was the secondary color, remember? And in the dark version, it will correspond to gray 00, that is white. If we look at this section of the paragraph, you're going to have on surface 2, that is going to be the color used on top of that surface. And for in one case, it's going to be gray 600, and for the other one, it's going to be white. And the same for the button. We can define a color that will be the background color that will correspond to the primary color, and another one for the text that is on top of that primary surface. All these abstractions could have been made by the designer. So if the designer does not make it, we will have to do it. So we can create abstractions on top of the tokens. I'm going to rush now. All this will be recorded. So what I did was to save those abstractions, and we can see that we have tokens that takes their value from some other tokens. This was the first layer that was less abstract, and the second layer that is more abstract. So now what we can do is to modify all the styles so that we can include all these new abstractions that were specified. I'm going to show you the final result. So now what I need to do is to specify the background color for the application. In the case of light, remember the light version was white. So I'm using this class application. This could be used for the main panel if it had another name. If to the main table, for instance, I apply this class to the main table, but because of the name, this is the class that is used for the body of HTML. So by doing this automatically, it will implement this class. I will run. There will be no changes because basically I made the application a little bit more abstract. I'm in Opera that allows me to change to dark, and there are no changes because we didn't specify anything about the dark mode. So how can we do it to specify something? I'm organizing the tokens, and here we have different options. So I can define the color scheme option. Color scheme is the one that allows us to indicate the color scheme, dark or light. When I write light between brackets, basically it shows that it's going to be the default mode. And then what I'm going to do is to change the color tokens depending on the color scheme. Which ones? Not these ones because they don't change, but these ones here, they change, and I will change them depending on the dark or light mode. So I'll be adding a condition for dark, and I will be specifying the same tokens, but with the values to be used when they are selecting the dark mode. So I change the secondary as a primary, the primary as secondary, and implementing all those changes that we went through kind of very quickly some minutes ago. And just by doing this, selecting for each color scheme the value of each token, that's enough. Then I run it and we can see the application in the light mode. And then if I move to the dark mode, I can see how it automatically implements the changes. So basically, this could be a summary. I'm running out of time now, let's see. Yes, Ceci, exactly. Just we will need to select some of the contents so that then we can have a Q&A session. We knew that this would happen. So I will just continue a little bit more. What I do then is to implement the master panel to create the master panel object that is basically doing the same thing. The master panel will be the one implementing the image at the top, the footer, and also we need to leave a space for individual pages to load. What is interesting about showing you the master panel is this part here, because we have some overlapping of controls. And what we told you, that what we showed there is like this is the same thing to create the rows for the table. Here we have the content placeholder, where you load all the individual pages. And what is interesting about this, that since version grade 5 of GeneXus, that allows us that when working with tables, flex controls, or canvas, we have these controls here that will allow us to create accessories for the apps. So when we tell it that this content will be the main content, once you run this on a browser, and if the person, for instance, has some site difficulties, it will allow it to change the content. And here with canvas control, whatever I include in that section can be placed in different layers. And I can define in which layer each control will be shown. What is interesting about that is that the chatbot button, remember that you could see it on top of the image? That is what we could see at the end of the clip and how to upload that image. And then we could see how the image also changes depending on the mode, light or dark. Remember that all this will be included in the course. So now this is the final version. And this is the same app developed by Nico. And according to what he said, he created this in 4 hours. And we can see then how easy it is to create all this in just a couple of hours. This is a flex grid that has information of the database. All this is uploading all the information in the database. I wanted to show you also the dark mode. Okay, just don't worry, we're running out of time. This is the roadmap of what we have done. And just to finish, is how we develop all this from scratch. You start with a general analysis of the pages. We check all those aspects that are repeated. We need to check whether the designer builds styles, if there is a conceptual design, if some tokens, or if there are tokens or styles for the colors and the content and the texts. We go through that general analysis where we identify all those aspects that are repeated. We create basic DSO, where basically we reflect all those components in the DSO, the font, face, color tokens, all the classes for repeated elements, another kind of tokens like font sizes, spacing, all those things, and at the same time to include all those assets, font imports, all the icons, SVG. And after these two main steps, we're going to be implementing the master panel and also the individual ones. And something else that we discussed together with Nico, and something that he suggested, is to have a basic DSO as the one we saw, with all the aspects that we identified in the first two steps, and then after that, to build a DSO for each of the panels to be implemented. So for instance, we can create a master panel that imports the basic DSO, it adds all the specific tokens or classes for that object, and the same thing for each of the panels. This will allow us to create modules. Basically, in the base DSO, we have something that is shared by all of them, and then all the specific aspects of each object in each of the others. And then at the platform level, we have the DSO that imports all these others. So the DSO on the platform will be this one, that will be importing all this. Sorry, I rushed, but that will be the presentation. All this, that it's a piece that we lost a part of it, of course, is going to be completely developed and presented in the course. Thank you, Cecilia. We had a lot to share, and we wanted to show you a specific case. We ran out of time, sorry about that. So now, Aníbal, you have the floor. We have several questions, and some of them were already answered. We have one here by Cristian Valverde that reads, can you compare word ratio and GeneXus? Nicolas, that is all yours. I tried to answer that question, but I didn't quite understand it. These are two different applications. We are talking about two different platforms. I couldn't answer that. Another one then. Text font styles, are those created through DSO? Is that right? Yeah. As we made progress, that was already answered when I was showing that through Figma. Yeah, it is clear that those styles are reflected in GeneXus. Sebastián Peláez, why is it that those spaces are defined as columns? Isn't it easier or more efficient to create classes with a margin or padding? Because if you do this, you're creating empty divs. There are no differences when it comes to efficiency between these two possibilities. You can do everything based on margins, or you can use empty rows or columns. When it comes to efficiency, it's exactly the same. There are no empty divs. The empty columns are just that, empty. So from the efficiency standpoint, it's exactly the same. The point here is which one is easier to implement. So whether to use margins or empty rows and columns, which is more efficient. We talked a lot about this with Cecilia Fernandez, and it depends on your personal preference. That is the conclusion we got to. For me, it's better to have empty rows and columns because I can see everything from the layout, or you can use margins and there's no problem. So it's just about personal preferences. There are small advantages and disadvantages, but they both work perfectly all right. Marcos Flores is asking here whether the KB and the resources will be available to practice with this application. Maybe in the chat we can share the link for the application developed by Nico so that you can have a look at it. What we're going to make available are some resources to Chechu, and then we're going to send an email with all that information, with some other resources. The KB is not going to be included at first because we are building and creating the course. And you will see all this on the course. Rodrigo Castro is asking, in case you don't have a designer in the project, which would be the way to learn Figma? I don't know whether there's one recommended way. Figma has a lot of documentation. It has a free YouTube channel with a lot of videos. They provide a lot of contents for you to learn how to use the tool. That can be one option. Another option can be taking some course online or just learning everything on your own. Christian Valverde is asking, how do we implement some logic that is used only in the UI layer? It's a little bit complex, that question. It's not very clear. I don't know if he's talking about the organization of the UI elements, how to implement it, basically talking to the developer and saying which is the best way for both of them working together and keeping that logic, I guess. Fabian Presa, header part of the menu, it just resolves, and then you can have a burger. Sorry, the question was not clear. That example is not finished, and when it comes to header and how it responds, I cannot understand strategically what the question is about. The question was not very clear. Maybe Ceci and Nico. How responsive is the application? In GeneXus, you can define how to design a layout for a format. For instance, in our case, we were designing for text web, but on that same panel, you can add some elements and prepare it for small webs, for mobile phones, for tablets. So by defining that new design, what you are saying there is that once you are in that format or using a device with that screen size, it will look like this or like that. You can define the platform and you are defining the size. There's another section that Ceci showed when you define the customization of platforms there on the right. You can define the different sizes, the tablet formats, the font formats, or the text format. That would be the responsive, defining the layout and what the screen looks like for a specific format. Okay, he got it. Okay, so last question. Let's move on. Romero is asking, good afternoon. All the capacities of the DSO, how do they coexist with the patterns? It's not that much focus on patterns. It's a design from scratch. So I think that doesn't correspond here. What I can tell you about that is that in the application, what you do is to define which design system you're going to be using. In our case, we design this DSO, and those are the styles to be used in the application. But if you use a pattern, you need to know which is defined on the KB. All the elements will end up in the DSO. So depending on what you have in the DSO, what your application will look like. But in the summary is that the patterns approach does not correspond here. Okay, thank you very much, Nico. Thank you very much, Ceci and Chechu. Thank you all. for being here in this webinar. There are some pending questions. We're going to be sending them to the speakers, and then we're going to be sharing the answers with you. Thank you very much. There was one question whether this session is recorded or not. Yeah, it is recorded. And now you can go to www.genexus-webinars. So see you next time. Thank you.